Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry about that. My screen was telling me that there was an error. Welcome. It is Friday, and welcome to Coffee Time with Masterminds. Last week was probably our toughest episode. We suspended our regular scheduled conversation to address and talk about the racial injustice and civil unrest that our nation was facing at that time and still is. We're about 17 days in, as well as what's happening across the world. We discuss what nonprofit leaders could do, and yet we recognize that we're all in this for the first time. But we also talked about how nonprofits can begin to check their systems and processes to ensure that they are not creating the oppressive systems that the very protesters are fighting against. We also reflected. The producers and the co hosts of Coffee Time for Masterminds started this as a conversation because when COVID hit us, a lot of us were dealing with the day to day and trying to figure that out. But as leaders, we also know that we always have to be a step ahead. And this was a conversation to begin talking about together what that would or could look like. And we saw a theme come across all the episodes. We have to pivot fast, adjust, adapt, and innovate. There was no other choice. There is no other choice. And we at Coffee Time for Masterminds took our own advice. We too have had to be nimble and responsive. This is not to say that COVID 19 is not important. There's another crisis on our hands. These are truly unprecedented times. But in light of what's happening, we cannot ignore the crisis and the opportunity that comes with that. So today, we're going to have a great show. Before I bring on my co host, I do want to mention that today's show, we're going to talk about how we advocate for the communities we serve without characterizing them as lacking or deficient. How can we help funders make an investment into our vibrant and thriving neighborhoods? And they all are. We'll be discussing what it means to use an asset based approach when we talk about our neighborhoods and the important differences that make our ability to serve them effectively. And then how that translates to our work. And Rebecca is going to explain exactly how to respond to the needs section of a grant proposal, which she says is one of the most, if not the most important part of your grant proposal. So let's begin with introductions. We ask that if you are watching us live, to please put your name in the comments and tell us where you're from. And then I'm going to begin with my co-host, Peter. Hi, Peter. How are you?
Good morning, Cynthia. I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good. Do you want to introduce yourself? I didn't introduce your company. I'm
I
sorry.
am Peta Blakely. I am the founder and principal of Blakely Consulting, and I help mission-based organizations to measure and maximize their impact.
You do. That's important work. Thank you, Peter. And
Thanks.
then I'm going to bring Rebecca Tuttle onto our screen. And onto our screen. Hi, Rebecca.
Good morning,
Good
Cynthia.
morning.
Good morning, Peter. How are you guys?
Good.
I'm Rebecca Tuttle. I'm the founder and creator of Grant Right Now and Grant Writing for Good. We help schools, organizations, and businesses find, write, and secure grant funding, and we teach you how to do it.
Awesome. And I am Cynthia Rojas, and I'm the founder and principal of To Your Growth. And I specialize in organizational development, change management, and leadership development. So let's jump right in while our viewers, Benjamin says good morning. Thank you, Benjamin, for
Good
watching.
morning.
And so, as our viewers begin to introduce themselves, let's jump right in. So, Rebecca and Peter, my first question is tell me first why this is an important issue. What is it that we're talking about? And why is this an important issue, especially at this time?
Well, first, I want to go back to something you said in the introduction. We're 17 days into this.
Yes.
time, 17 days, that's a long time.
Mm-hmm.
A long time.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think it's really important topic because it shows us that just how important it is to be mindful that we treat everyone in every community with respect, and that we should never underestimate people's capabilities within those communities. We should assume that everyone that we're working with, especially in grant funding, can achieve more, can make a difference in their community. So the key here really is thinking about communities from a place of capability, which is why we had asset-based programming, interwoven into the title of today's show, and doing away with the deficit-based approach.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Peter. Thank you, Rebecca. Peter, why do you see this topic as important? You and Rebecca were really excited about today.
Yeah. I get really animated and I really have a reaction to the way we sometimes talk about neighborhoods that are economically disadvantaged and neighborhoods that are predominantly minority. And how I see this playing out is it's racism at a geographic level. We mischaracterize them. We talk about them as not having any assets, about having a lot of need, without consulting these communities, right? Without building on the strengths that they have. They become caricatures, just the same way racism makes individuals a caricature. They become a caricature of a neighborhood. And we say things like, that's a bad neighborhood. It's an outrageous thing to say. In every neighborhood, there are children growing up and there are families thriving and there are people organizing and there is community and vibrancy and culture. How can you characterize a neighborhood as bad? It might just be momentarily under-resourced. And when we talk about neighborhoods from that deficit perspective, we put things in as if they're an empty vessel rather than building on the capacities that they have. So we might build things that are inappropriate or irrelevant, or we might build things that the neighborhood can't sustain without us. And either of those is doing a disservice to the community.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for that. Rebecca, do you have additional thoughts on what Peter just said?
Peter, you just reminded me about the importance of offering funding for capacity building. And more often than not, when we see RFPs or announcements for capacity building opportunities, folks look around and they're like, well, what exactly is capacity building? So we're almost in a sense answering that today, in our conversation.
Yeah.
Because what capacity building tells us is, what is the capacity of your organization to respond to the needs in your community? And then here is a capacity building grant opportunity so that you can work on some of that responsiveness. One of the ways,
it's so important to build that capacity. I think about it as the organization becoming more and more sophisticated. And it's very important to build that and to build that in place, right? We need the individuals and the staff in a location to be building their capacity to maintain those programs.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And another important way that this plays out in grant writing is that one of the most important sections, if not the most important section of any grant proposal, is the needs section. That's the justification of why you should be awarded those funds for what you as the grant applicant are proposing to a funder. And this is the section where we use the research and the data to really justify why those funds coming in here are going to help make people's lives better off in our community. And if you can't get that section right, meaning you don't have a pulse on what is going on in your community, you're not on the ground talking to people in neighborhoods, asking them, what is it that you need? How can we help you? And you're not studying what has historically worked in the past. Although interestingly, I think we should be studying real-time data more so than what worked, because a lot of this data we put in our grants is 2, 3, 4, 6 years old. We should be studying data from the past 17 days, really, and and developing more of that data, more of that collection and measure, and putting that into our proposals. And, a lot of times if you can't get this section right, you risk not being funded or being underfunded, which can be really damaging to communities.
And the reason that the funders are asking for that information is that they want to direct resources to communities that need, right? That need those resources where they're going to make a difference. So I get it. And generally how we approach that section is we look at geographic data, like from the census, and we say things like, here's how many people in this community are living in conditions of poverty, are minority, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a better way to talk about it.
Absolutely. As grant writers, they're trained to report on their community with terms like low income or poor communities or undereducated. And it goes back to what you had said earlier, Peta, about mislabeling the potential of communities, And also, we have a social responsibility that if we can say outwardly that, communities are underserved and this is why, we have a social responsibility to bring more services in there without focusing on the deficit that's keeping them there, but more focusing on the asset or the potential for them once these things are brought in there, once these grants and funding and resources are brought to those communities, the good things that they can do with it. And I think we really need to shift the whole conversation with how philanthropy is distributed to communities. And I'm not suggesting we do that today, but I think that
that's going to be a great show.
That's going to be a great show.
I have a little bit of time. We can talk about it today.
But it's up to us really as the grant proposers to portray that, to talk about our community in ways that everyone within it, when we receive these resources, they have the potential, they have the asset to make a difference, to change their community, and we shouldn't be underestimating that. Ever.
And when you are designing a program from that deficit-based perspective, there's always a chance it's not going to be the right program, right? It's not the one that the community asked for. It is, in many instances, based, again, on negative stereotypes about this population that you're writing about, and it is not going to be effective. At best, it's not going to be effective. At worst, it's going to be destructive.
One of the things I'm struggling with, though, is that if you have to talk about need, and we should probably talk about definitions first, right? So, Rebecca, you said the needs section is where you justify why you're looking for funding. Is that a good summation of that? Okay. Deficit. What do we mean by a deficit lens or deficit approach?
So when we apply for grants, we apply for funds and resources to solve problems within our community where we're going to apply those resources and funding. So when we talk about deficit, that's really the problem that we're addressing in a grant proposal, the problem that we're looking to solve. But deficit is not, it doesn't show opportunity to make promise to make change. So really we have to do away with some of these terms like deficit and low income to show funders, because ultimately funders want to fund communities. They're making an investment in that community to make that community rise up, fare better, bring good to that community. If we ask funders to bring funding to a deficit, that saying that out loud, right, it's a turnoff, right? So we need to be focusing more on the asset and not necessarily the deficit.
You want to define asset-based approach or asset-based lens?
So when I'm talking about taking an asset-based lens, I mean, let's build on what this community has. And it might be both formal and informal things. So local businesses, local not-for-profits, those are the kind of formal institutions that are there. And also there's a whole wealth of informal institutions and assets, care networks, strong families, cultural ties, social assets, civic engagement, philanthropy, all of that is super abundant in the lower income neighborhoods and the communities of color. And those are the things that we want to make sure we're designing our programs around and building on. I heard a great expression in a town meeting last night. Nothing about us without us is for us, which I thought was fantastic. And what I take away from that is, even in the past, we have even neglected to engage the community in designing its own program. But here are some really great examples of how you can engage community. One program had that was about sexual health, wanted young people to understand and create a map of all the places in their community where you could get condoms. And so they hired youth to go out into their community and do this research project. And they came up with locations that the adult health workers never knew about. And yeah, I mean, one of their major findings was barbershops. The health professionals didn't know that. It wasn't on their radar. The youth found it, they put it on the map, and now they've created this resource so that other young people can use to get condoms. So there's a great example of taking the assets that are there to understand the assets that were already there in the community.
But how did they find that out?
They went door to door and they looked for them.
Right, they went out into the neighborhood.
They went into the neighborhood. I mean, partly I think it was they were from the neighborhood, so they had some clues about where to look, right? Mm-hmm. But yeah, they did the footwork.
That's awesome.
That's a great example. That's a great example. And so, God, I lost my train of thought. I had to do with something Peter said. Okay, sorry. So now let's go back to grants, right? Yeah. So Rebecca, we were talking about grants and how to then apply this to when you're writing a grant. I'm still struggling just because I'm very literal. So when you talk about need, you automatically are assuming a deficit, right? Help me reconcile how I can show up. I'm trying to tell an investor, invest in my program because it's going to do X. And is it bad if I talk about all the great things that are happening? I mean, this is what you're arguing. It's not bad. But would it minimize the need? And would it jeopardize my grant? Did that make sense?
Yes, it does. So let me ask you this. Cynthia, will you fund my neighborhood? There's all kinds of problems here. There's all kinds of issues. I don't know. People aren't really successful here, but we need money. So will you give it to us? Would you fund it?
I see. Well, you're vague and the problem seems really big. And it almost sounds like it's hopeless.
Right. That's a deficit.
Got it. Right? That's good, Rebecca.
So will you make investments in hopelessness? No, absolutely not. See, why else would we include research in our grant? As we're justifying the need, we're saying this is the need in our community. For example, 70% of the community lives below the federal poverty guidelines. We're not saying 70% of our community is low income. We're saying by all economic standards on paper, our community falls within the federal poverty guidelines, which meets the paper definition of low income. However, here is the potential of our community, and we're not focusing on the community being low income and their inability to make progress or, fall within a category or a deficit. We're focusing on, yes, while 70% of the families in this community fall within the federal poverty guideline, with your investment in our community, we can create jobs. We can stimulate economic growth. We can bring business to this community. And so you see, it will help to bring the people who fall within that category on paper a new job, a new opportunity. That investment from the funder will help lift up their circumstance and ultimately bring assets to that community.
That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. We have a comment, and so I just want to bring it on the screen from May. She reads, a lot of my schools want to write grants for extra monies because so many programs either left or were removed due to budget cuts. How should they approach it without emphasizing on the need?
That's a great question, May. So what I would do is I would say, here is the result of your budget cuts, right? Here is what happened when you remove those critical programs and services to the children in our community. And we want to bring them back because research shows if we do this in our community, then these are the anticipated results. Because we use the research to show the need without claiming the deficit, right? We use the research to show the percentage of disadvantage within our community, but we also use the research to justify why the funds should come in. Because if we put this in place, it's that if this, then this favorable result will come. And so if you point out, this is interesting. See, we're working on this right now. If you point out the deficit that was created as a result of the removal of the favorable items or the favorable programs, then your argument can be convincing enough to have them put those systems and programs back into place.
This is another place where your outcomes data really matters too, right? I mean, you don't want to make the argument, oh, we have this program and now we don't. Please replace it, without saying, here is why that program mattered, and here is how this community was leveraging that program to create their thriving community, right? So if you can say, this is how many young people were using it, this is how many more young people were graduating from high school as a result of that program, now you can really demonstrate more effectively that taking this program away is creating a deficit without blaming the community, right? Without saying that they were lacking, right?
May says, that's great, because it's exactly what she told them to focus on, of why the program was working.
Got it. And that's why it's so important to be collecting meaningful, well, one of the reasons why it's so important to be collecting meaningful outcome data.
And sharing it, pushing it out into the community and advocating for these things, and asking, why was the budget cut here and here and here when that was really working, or that has the potential to be tremendously successful?
Yeah, no, that's great. May is in a really good position because if she has outcome data already, then that becomes what she what she can use. And investors like winners. Yeah, she's saying sometimes she's smart. I'm sure you're very smart, May.
I feel like 20 years ago, investors were just winging it, right? We're willing to fund programs just on the hope that they were doing something or that the model worked. And when there's less money to disperse, they have to be more careful. And I'm in favor of that. I support that. I don't think that we should be running programs if we can't demonstrate their effectiveness. But that's a topic for another show.
Yeah.
And investors, they like winners. Somebody told me years ago that investors invest in results. They don't invest in programs. They're not into the logistics of what's working and which program is better. They want to know, what are your outcomes? How are you making the world a better place through their investment? And if you're able to do that, then you're a winner. Everybody loves winners. Everybody loves winners.
Cynthia, so I don't hear deficit in there anywhere.
I know. You taught me something. This is so awesome.
We got it.
Yeah.
No. But talking these things through, this is how you gain better understanding of how to approach these things. So everyone has the potential to be successful. Everyone, no matter where you are and what you're doing, right?
Right.
So the question then becomes, how do we describe the needs of our population, who some people feel is a deficit, to a funder who also uses that same type of language when they require us to serve low-income communities, to help poor people, to bring resources and services to undereducated communities. So and they're not, philanthropists don't use this language because they are talking about our communities from a deficit. It's because that is the common terminology that exists within the whole field of fund development. And we need to change that by having these kinds of conversations. And so how do you show a funder that you serve those needs without yourself labeling the populations you serve by those terms? So we need to shift the terminology.
Use that language partly because that's the data that's available.
Right.
So, one of the easy ways that you can, relatively easy ways that you can compare one zip code to another zip code is with census data. And the census collects things like how many people live in your household, how many children are there, what is your race, ethnicity, what language do you speak, that kind of thing. So that's the data that we have to compare neighborhoods. And when the funder is, should we send this money to Chicago or this money to Boston, they want to be able to compare. But that's the absolute bare minimum of what you should know and convey about your community. It's not what they don't have, it's what do we have here that we're going to build on resources.
I want to give you a chance to talk about why this topic is important in this context and what we're facing nationally. Tell us how this all comes together.
Because when we talk about neighborhoods from a deficit perspective, we are characterizing the residents there from a deficit perspective. And we are reinforcing our national myth that living in conditions of poverty signals a failure of character. These neighborhoods are historically plundered. They're not the way they are. They're not experiencing deficits that they have because people there are lazy or not religious enough or, whatever narratives we make up about that, not family oriented enough, like whatever. That's, racist. I was going to say a bad word, but right? That is not the right way to talk about our communities. What we are realizing as a country now is that there is historic inequality, right? People who are living in conditions of poverty right now did not invent poverty and did not select that for themselves in their neighborhoods. And despite the fact that these communities have been treated these ways for all of these years, we have individuals and families and communities that are incredibly smart and resourceful and engaged and committed and united. How do we talk about that?
Nice.
And I don't hear deficit. I don't hear deficit.
I love this. Rebecca, we have about a minute and a half left. I know you are spending your days teaching others everything you know, which is just amazing. Do you want to talk about what you have coming up?
Sure. Absolutely. Thanks, Cynthia. So, this is a really interesting conversation. And, going back to why is this so important right now? A lot of what's going on around us is uncertainty. I mean, we thought we didn't know when COVID hit, right? Look at in 17 days, how much has changed, how much has bubbled up and evolved. There is still so much more uncertainty that lie ahead. And I think it's going to be a lot longer than 17 days. So I thought, how can we continue to help change the narrative of how we apply for funds and how we allocate resources in our community? So on Tuesday, the 16th of June at 7 p.m., I'm going to do a live webinar, and the description and link are here in the comments. And it's basically grant writing in uncertain times, and we're going to focus on need versus necessity. So while your community has overall needs, what are the immediate necessities that you need to focus on and find funding for in times that we're going through of this uncertainty and uncertainty going forward? So if you'd like to join, it's a free webinar. The link is here, and it's next Tuesday at 7.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. We have about 5 seconds. Biggest takeaway, Peter.
I think my biggest takeaway is that the way I think about neighborhoods also has to be written into that very specific section of the grant application, and how to turn that so that you are reflecting what the funder needs to know without violating your own standards about how you talk about your community.
Yeah. Rebecca, big takeaway.
Yes. So I lead with compassion in everything I do. And if you lead with compassion and you lead with kindness and you lead with the hope for opportunity for better outcomes, you can't go wrong. And so when I think about the challenges that we're facing or what lie ahead, I think, how can I enter into those scenarios and come out still with that compassion and kindness and forward thinking? And that is going to eliminate a lot of this deficit thinking that we have.
Mm-hmm. Well, my big takeaway is what you say is also a reflection of what you think and what you believe. And
Yeah,
so
that's
if
right.
we change the language, we can change how we think about things and we could change our belief system, all for the better. So thank you. Thank you so much. All right. We'll
Oh,
see you.
we have some comments. We have 4 comments we missed.
Oh, I
Did we
am
get to them?
sorry. We got to May.
Yep.
Okay. Okay.
Yep.
I didn't want to leave anyone out of our.
Yeah, no, we got to them. Thank you so much, everyone, and we'll see you
you.
next week, same time, same day. Bye.
Have a great
Take
weekend.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.